And now it's over to you, Morten.
Okay, thank you. And good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Morten Barbæk. I'm working for the Norwegian Mapping Authority in ISO TC 211. I'm also the convener of Working Group 4 on geospatial services. And I have also been involved in interoperability between the GIS and the BIM platforms. But today I will talk about some work that has been going on the national level. And I don't think I need to give a presentation of Norway, but just mention that it's a quite large area, 324,000 square kilometer land territory and 2 million square kilometer sea territory, and not that many people, 5.3 million inhabitants. But what is more important in this context is that Norway has been active in standardization since the 1990s, actually even before that, as well as some research programs. So Norway has always had a long story on standardization. Also before it was started international work. I will come back to that. We have been active in ISO TC 211 since the start in 1994. And most of the standards from ISO TC 211, they ends up as Norwegian standards through Standards Norway. Um, the the agenda for today is actually the last bullet point here, that the Norwegian Mapping Authority, we have a mandate from the ministry to complement official standards when that is needed. And this uh, this kind of standards is named SOSI, the Coordinated Approach of Spatial Information. And you can, of course, ask, when there are so many international standards, why do we have to make some complement official standards in Norway? And I hope to answer that by this presentation. I actually have two presentations today, one on modeling and one on how we use the modeling standard. And I will present that after the break, and I will also take my conclusions in connection with my last presentation. I hope that is okay. So I mentioned that we have been active for quite some time now, and we have gone through different stages, and we have always been interested in modeling. We have a modeling approach in Norway, which we have followed from the 1990s. And we started with the ER models, entity relationship models. Some of you probably remember that some time ago. They were very simplified, but it was a start. It was giving some information in a graphical way that helped the users to understand the data. We also had a quick look into express modeling. That was also uh, in the view of both ISO TC 211 in the very early days, and also on the European standardization CEN TC 287, the work which we did there, which was transferred to ISO. Further on, 1997, we switched to object modeling, but not for a very long time. When ISO decided to use UML and UML class diagram and the object constraint language, we switched to UML, and we have been following ISO TC 211 standards and UML until today. So these are different levels of conceptual formalism, and this will probably continue to change in the future. Nothing will be unchangeable. Also focusing on national standards. I mentioned the umbrella name SOSI, Coordinated Approach for Spatial Information. And it's not the first version I mentioned here, but it is version 1.4 from 1990, where it was quite small. Only 7 teams plus Cadastre. We had our own syntax exchange format, and it was very thematic code oriented. But it was a good start. It was easy to explain for the users how this standard worked. Moving on to a bit later, 1994, we had version 2.1, 19 teams, and the teams are, of course, getting bigger all the time, where we actually introduced the term product specification. Further on, version 4, 2007, and until 2016, that's where we started to work with national standards, fully compliant with standards from ISO TC 211. 57 teams, generic team models was the focus. And finally, up to now, version 5 from 2016 and to 2020, where we have a focus on data product specification and, of course, data product specification according to ISO 19131 data product specifications. Different development stages. Ontology is important and is getting more and more important. This diagram or picture is from Stage 0 project on ontology that the committee did some years ago, where we see that there is an evolvement here from weak semantics to strong semantics. And we are still at the UML level, SOSI version 4.0 in our national standards. But we do, of course, look into OWL and RDF and schools. So we are always working in the direction of stronger semantics. And we hope to do that in close cooperation with the ISO TC 211, of course. So the National Spatial Data Infrastructure for 2020, you have probably seen the figure on the right. It is used in several documents, and we have a similar one in Norway. And in this context, it is the data and the content which is the focus for this presentation. And all the data and content, which we used to call the knowledge base of the infrastructure, is modeled according to international standards. And there's also a requirement in our technological framework for the SDI that it should be modeled. The technological framework, that is not a standard, but it's a document provided as a cooperation between the stakeholders. So it is a normative document, and it has several requirements. Some of these requirements are related to national legislation, here under INSPIRE, of course, but there are also some requirements you can call best practice requirements, following up this model approach, and then stating a requirement that these models should be modeled according to national international standards. So far, so good. Then let's move on to what we do at the national level. And as the title say, we have a national standard for modeling geospatial data and services. That's the picture you see to the right. And it has a lot of normative references, and it's actually here it begins. When I give this presentation now, I see that I have mixed some numbers here, so let's not look at the numbers but the name. We have normative references to the conceptual schema language, to the spatial schema, to the temporal schema, rules for application schemas, coverages, GML, observation and measurements, data quality, and finally the procedures for the item registration. which means that we have taken the conceptual part from these standards, putting them all together in one document, focusing on making it easier for the national users to read these standards, to catch the requirement that they involve, with examples, for example, on UML in Norwegian language, and also for Norwegian teams. And yeah, so the whole idea behind this is a kind of an outreach, but we do outreach in the form of national standards. But it goes beyond ISO. I mean, the European interoperability framework and the reference architecture is, of course, also very important normative references. And finally, also the RFC 5656, I think that is on language, ISO 639, 8601 on time and date, etc. And we also extensively use the reference model for the open distributed processing. This modeling standard doesn't only focus on UML application schemas. You see in the figure to the right that it starts with business processes, BPMN 2.0, and also including Archimate. Archimate is not really UML as we understand it, but it's often implemented in the same tools that implement UML, for example, Enterprise Architect. We use case diagrams also according to UML2. We have service models according to UML2, and finally UML application schemas. And in addition to this, we describe our registry in similar to ISO TC 211 and the harmonized model repository. We have a repository of the models that we have provided for our SDI. We also have some annexes to this. We have a use case template as an informative description on how you could describe use cases. We have examples on how these different model approaches fits together. How could you actually include a UML application schema in a process diagram? We have another example or annex on how to model national data based upon Inspire. Again, this is quite a general mechanism from UML2, where we realize concepts in Inspire in the national infrastructure. It seems very easy, but it is not. I have to say that the willingness among Norwegian users to actually apply this modeling technique is not very large. It seems to be just another level of confusion. So that's something we have to work with. And finally, we have a template for the textual description of the models. We generate them automatically from the models in the same way as we have done on some of the standards in the ISO TC 211 family. So this is some examples on diagrams or models that we explain in this standard. And they are in Norwegian, of course. I do not think it's not my intention that you should read them, but just see that there are different kind of diagrams. And yeah, the first one is not really a special diagram, but it's how we handle multilinguality, which is also an issue in Norway. We have the business process modeling notation with the famous pizza story, how to order a pizza, not really related to spatial information at all, but it probably makes it easier for users to understand. We have service specifications, how you move from an abstract specification to a platform independent specification, and finally to a platform specific service specification. a bit theoretical, I must say. And this is one of the areas where we probably need to revise a little. We have use cases. We use the citizen portal just as an example on how we do use cases. Lower left, we have a SOSI profile of ISO 19109, the general feature model, which means it's not fully identical. It is conformant, of course, with the ISO standard, but there are some minor modifications. And I think that one of them is that a feature property element always have to be related to a feature type. And I think the general feature model is not that strict, but that is a detail. We also focus on object diagrams, as you see in the middle on the lower part. And finally, we have a very simple introduction to UML. This is not a learning book on UML, but we have one page focusing on the most important constructs of UML. Yeah, that was actually the end of my first presentation. So I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Does anybody have a question? I don't see any hands raised at this point in time. I would like to, if nobody else has a question, you make it seem so easy and seamless. What were some of the challenges that you faced along the way in getting to this, to the point where you are now at version 5?
Yeah, one of the challenges is, of course, that it's quite time consuming to do this. It takes quite a lot of resources. And that is also resources that could have been applied more directly for the international standards. So yeah, it's a difficult issue. I think the Norwegian users, and not only the Norwegian users, but I think users in general, they find the ISO standards quite difficult if they are not really involved in this in some places. It's quite hard to buy a bunch of ISO standards and start reading them and start implementing it. So in any way, you need to form some kind of groups where people sit together and trying to discuss how this actually works and how it should be implemented. And I think that is what we have obtained by this process. The question is if we are, what should I say, so experienced now in the infrastructure that that kind of outreach maybe is not that important anymore, but I focus on maybe. I mean, most people still find ISO standards quite complex.
I think they are complex, but their benefits are felt after all the hard work has been done. We have another question here saying, any key level information on feedback from SOSI and return on investment?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Any key level information on feedback from SOSI and return on investment?
Yeah, good question. We more indirectly we do have that because in Europe we have established something called the Location Interoperability Framework Observatory. It's an action within the ISA program of the European Commission. And related to this, there are some recommendation on how to integrate spatial information with more general data from public administrations. And in this situation, there are also some recommendations on standards. And as a result of this, a questionnaire has been put out, and one of the responses there is actually the return of investment. It's not only related to standards, but it's more related to the SDI in general. But of course, the standards is an important part of the SDI. So indirectly, we do have some feedback on the of the return of investment. But I do not have any numbers to provide you here. Maybe I can add that in my last presentation.
Yes, I think that's always, I think, what the financial people would want to know. If you do all this work, what are the financial benefits? But we have a last question from Australia. Do you have any suggestions on how to engage groups in taking up modeling system? I'm finding it a problem. So if you can leave us with a cheer of inspiration, please, Morten.
Yeah, a share of inspiration and the hard work. I think most of the countries, they have some kind of organization around this. And I think the issue here is to have some group who will also be responsible for the standards. I mean, in the large SDI groups, standards is part of it, but it seems that focus often goes more on other SDI issues. So specific groups on standardization with mandate to use standards and implement standards in the SDI, I think that would be helpful.
Thank you, Morten. Eva, do you feel inspired?
If I am inspired?
No, if Standards Australia feel they are equipped. Jan from Denmark has a comment.
Yes, actually, yes, thank you very much. Actually, in support of what Morten just said, legislation could also help in improving or high-level governmental support might improve the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan.